Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. We're going to get started here in just a few minutes.
Buenas tardes a todos. Vamos a iniciar en unos minutos. Uh-oh. Mm. Mm.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Apologize for the delay, but we are ready to get started. Welcome to the Housing Action Package 2.0 workshop. This is for the portion of the Housing Action Package encouraging new homes. My name is Seth Lichney. I am the Program Manager for Housing Policy with the City of San Diego Planning Department. Joining me today from our Housing Policy team are Senior Planners Melissa Garcia, Sean McGee, and Corey Funk, and also Associate Planner Victoria Ortiz. We are also joined today by two Spanish interpreters, Helen Artenstein and Vicky Lundberg, and I'll hand it over to Helen to make the announcement about translation services.
Buenas tardes, soy Helen. Si alguien va a necesitar interpretación en español, por favor, usen el icono de levantar la mano para saber si hay gente que necesite este servicio.
We're just waiting to see if anyone raises their hand needing a Spanish interpretation or not.
Estamos esperando para ver si alguno de ustedes va a necesitar este servicio de interpretación. Como dije anteriormente, pueden usar el icono de levantar mano y así sabemos cuántos o si no hay ninguno. Gracias.
We'll just give it another minute in case anyone else needs to raise their hand.
Daremos un minuto más para ver si alguien levanta mano.
Okay, thank you. We'll proceed. So welcome to the workshop for Housing Action Package 2.0. The intent and purpose of today's workshop is to introduce our proposed initiatives. There are 12 initiatives overall that are being presented as part of Housing Action Package 2.0. This is the first of 4 workshops that we'll be holding to get feedback on those initiatives. And we do want to receive your feedback, your comments, your suggestions on these ideas. We will be recording this webinar and posting it online so that folks can see the workshops and see the presentation on the information that's provided. And we also have a Housing Action Package 2.0 website where you can find more information about the proposals. Next slide. So this is a list of HAP 2.0, the proposed initiatives. As I mentioned, there are 12 total initiatives. Today, we'll be talking about encouraging more homes. So that will include the implementation of Assembly Bill 2097, accessible ADU incentives, ADU and JADU revisions, housing on public land, and student housing. The other initiatives will each be presented at future workshops, and the next slide shows the schedule for the upcoming workshops. So we do have a virtual workshop being held on Thursday from 2 to 4. Then we'll be following those up in early March with 2 in-person workshops, one on Senate Bill 10 implementation and one on discontinued harmful use and anti-displacement measures. And you can see the information there. This is also available on our Housing Action Package 2.0 website. So I'll hand it over to Sean McGee, who will just give a little bit of guidance about the Zoom Q&A.
Good afternoon, everyone. So we want to ensure that everybody has an opportunity to ask questions both verbally and via text during the presentation. So to submit a question verbally, we'll be taking those at the end of the presentation, and you simply need to select the raise hand icon in the webinar controls found at the bottom of your Zoom window. At that time, you may be prompted to unmute yourself. If you have a question that comes up during the presentation, please click the Q&A icon in your webinar controls, and you may receive either a verbal response at the end of the presentation or a text response during the presentation. We're going to do our best to answer all questions that you might have, but if we're unable to do so due to time constraints, please contact us at homesforallofus@sandiego.gov. And we kindly request that you limit all of your questions to the topics addressed by the presentation today. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. And with that, we'll dive right into the first proposal. This is the implementation of Assembly Bill 2097, which was approved by the California legislature and signed by the governor in 2022. The intent of the bill is to eliminate parking minimums for residential and commercial developments that are within a half mile of a major transit stop. The idea is that zero parking minimums provide an incentive for new home development that normally will have to pay an expensive amount in order to provide parking on their development. Next slide. So the city of San Diego has current parking standard requirements, including a zero minimum parking standard for multifamily residential development that's within what's called the Parking Standards Transit Priority Area. The Parking Standards Transit Priority Area is defined as a half-mile radius around major transit stops that are identified in the short-term Regional Transportation Improvement Program. The current parking standards also require transportation amenities to be provided by projects that are within the parking standards TPA and are providing parking on site. These can include bicycle storage, transit pass subsidies, micro-mobility options, and vehicle charging spaces. In order to implement AB 2097, the Housing Action Package 2.0 will modify the city's parking standards. This would expand the parking minimums to include additional areas required by AB 2097. For example, AB 2097 says that the city needs to use the longer-term regional transportation plan for planned major transit stops, which means there would be an expansion of where the parking minimums would apply. AB 2097 also includes all residential and commercial development instead of only multifamily residential as currently required by the city. This also would affect the parking standards in other places in the city code. The city has a parking impact overlay zone, affordable housing, and residential zoning parking regulations that would need to point out that these standards do not apply if they're located within the geographic area defined by AB 2097. Second is our ADA accessible ADU incentives. This is needed because there are fewer residential options for persons with disabilities. We also have an aging population. With rents continuing to rise, more opportunities for housing that is accessible to everyone is needed in the city of San Diego. Housing Action Package 2.0 includes a proposal that would modify the city's existing ADU home density bonus program. This would allow for one ADA accessible bonus ADU in a development that already includes at least one unit that is deed restricted affordable. Second, additionally, the ADU and JADU revisions are included as part of the Housing Action Package 2.0. The Department of Housing and Community Development has requested the City of San Diego amend its codes and regulations to align with state-provided definitions. This is in particular to the junior accessory dwelling units regulations that are in the city's existing codes. In particular, HCD requested that we amend our efficiency kitchen definition to match current state law, amend the setbacks that are included as a requirement for JADUs, and also address the use of JADUs and accessory structures on a property. JADU standards revision included in Housing Action Package 2.0 will include amendments to the JADU requirements that they are allowed in detached garages and inside of ADUs themselves. Essentially, state law says that a JADU must be included inside of an existing structure and is not able to be included in detached garages and ADUs. We will also address the other JADU related revisions recommended by HCD. Additionally, to ensure that ADUs are still provided, there are many options that are provided for ADUs for homeowners. We would allow for an accessory dwelling unit to be constructed in a detached garage or an inside of ADUs if it meets similar requirements to a JADU. The next proposal is housing on public land. As part of Housing Action Package 1.0, the city adopted a program that allows for homes to be built on publicly owned land in areas that do not allow multiple dwelling unit developments. The projects must be located in mobility zones 1, 2, or 3, and they must be outside of land that's zoned for industrial, parks, or open space. Additionally, the projects must include 25% deed restricted affordable homes. The proposed amendments included in Housing Action Package 2.0 would allow for qualifying projects to be multiple dwelling unit developments that include affordable housing. They can utilize parcels that are zoned for multifamily residential, and it would expand the use of the program into Mobility Zone 4 with transportation amenities required. Additionally, the proposed housing developments could utilize an increased floor area ratio depending on the percentage of deed restricted base units. So for example, if a project were to exceed the 25% requirement, it would receive a higher FAR. Student housing is the final proposal that we'll be discussing today. We have 24 universities and communities or private colleges in the city of San Diego. These universities and colleges include an enrollment of nearly 250,000 students. There are only 4 schools that provide on-campus housing, and housing for students is critically needed. Dorm-style housing off-campus could help with meeting student housing needs. To incentivize student housing, Housing Action Package 2.0 includes an amendment to an existing low-income student housing density bonus program. It would provide a density bonus based on gross floor area of smaller homes so that dorm-style units could be included as part of the proposal. It would remove the requirement of an operating agreement with a university or college, and it would require the units for low-income students be comparable to the market rate units that are constructed. This concludes our presentation. So the next steps for the Housing Action Package include our initial public engagement, which will be ongoing through our workshops and also on our website. We'll be developing draft regulations to share in the spring before we start the hearing process with the Planning Commission in spring of 2023 and City Council Committee and full City Council in the summer of 2023. So I'll hand it back to Sean just to remind everyone how the question and answer session, how everyone can participate through the Q&A.
Okay, thanks, Seth. So again, just to reiterate, the instructions for asking questions are shown here on this slide. And in case we'll sort of proceed with the Q&A questions that are open currently, and then we'll move over to those who have raised their hands. So Seth, I've got a question here. Have you done studies to determine how many people will actually walk a mile to the bus stop to commute to work? Public transport in San Diego has historically had limited impact on traffic as most people still use a car to commute.
I think, Sean, I'm not sure if that relates to any of the proposals that we have in this package, but appreciate the comment.
Okay. Another question, could you clarify that the AB 2097 changes would also apply to single-family residential within a half mile? I believe that's what was said, but just looking to confirm.
That's correct. AB 2097 says that cities must have a 0 parking minimum within 1/2 mile of existing or planned for transit.
Another question, you mentioned AB 2097 specifies 1/2 mile, the TPA definition. City Council just passed a new definition of 1 mile to a TPA. Which of these is correct and which would be applied?
The 1 mile definition is what is included. It's a 1 mile walking distance that's included for a sustainable development area. The city still has a definition of a transit priority area, which is 1/2 mile as the crow flies from a major transit stop. In this instance, state law requires that we use the 1/2 mile distance for AB 2097. And so that's what we'll be looking to do with our code amendments as part of HAP 2.0 is to implement the state legislation in our municipal code.
Okay. And what is a major transit area?
So a major transit stop is defined in state law as being a rail station, a bus rapid transit station, what's called a major bus stop, which is the intersection of 2 or more bus lines that show up at certain intervals. Also can be ferry stops if there's transit access to the ferries. It's a definition that we that's in state law that we've been using to develop our transit priority area map for several years.
And to make existing junior accessory dwelling units conform as ADUs, will we have lower minimum sizes for ADUs going forward?
That would only be lower minimum sizes for an ADU that's in an attached garage, or excuse me, a detached garage, or within an ADU itself. ADUs the existing ADU requirements for the sizes of an ADU would not change.
Okay. And a question here for mentioning TPA guidelines. What about new SDA guidelines?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question.
Well, we'll move on. There's a question here of who is in charge of monitoring these deeded affordable units, ADUs, to ensure that they are actually being rented as affordable units. And will the city have an ArcGIS map so private citizens can see affordable ADUs in their area?
So the deed restriction process goes through the San Diego Housing Commission, and the any violation would be or any violation would be handled through either the Housing Commission or the city's code enforcement. As far as an online opportunity to see online where ADUs are developed, that is something that we could certainly consider in the future.
And another question, could you clarify if applicants can currently rely upon AB 2097 since it is technically state law even before the city's ordinance is passed?
I'd have to confer with development services on that issue. I believe because it's state law and did it take effect earlier this year that it would apply. We would want to make sure that our existing requirements line up with what's in state law.
So question here about how the city is going to ensure that ADUs and JADUs are built properly with permits. Is there any guidance on that?
I would suggest taking a look at the Development Services website. They have plenty of information about what's required for ADU construction and ADU and JADU permitting and construction.
Okay. All right. So I think with that, we're going to jump over to the raised hands. I just want to jump over and get to those individuals. So give me one moment. Okay, I've got a raised hand from Madison. Madison, I'm gonna ask you to unmute right now.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Running around.
Hi, thanks for doing this workshop. Madison Coleman, policy advocate with Climate Action Campaign. I just have one comment and then additional questions. So for the housing on public land, I think someone put it in the comment section, but we recommend that you all increase the percentage of affordable housing past 25%. Everyone knows that we are significantly behind on our RHNA targets, specifically as it relates to very low and low income categories. So that's my recommendation, or our recommendation and comment. And then as far as questions, I have a question pertaining to the accessible ADUs and the housing on public land, and they're the same question. For the deed restriction, how many years is that deed restriction, and then what income levels are those housing units going to be deed restricted for? Thank you.
So for the ADA accessible program, it would not be required to be deed restricted affordable. However, the proposed project would be required to have at least a deed restricted affordable unit ADU as part of any proposal. And then the second part for housing on publicly owned sites. Totally agree with your recommendation. Our intention is to allow for additional floor area ratio bonuses for projects that exceed the 25% affordable requirement. And so that could go from, again, up to 50%. Then we could also have an additional bonus for projects that go up to 100% affordable. We think this will be an opportunity for the publicly owned sites to maximize the amount of affordable housing that can be built on site.
Okay, we're going to go to Liz. I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. I am a curious and concerned citizen. I am wondering and I don't know if this can be answered, but with the various developments in ADUs and now junior ADUs within detached garages, et cetera, of course, to increase density, how are infrastructure fees being assessed? And how does that apply so that we can support the growing development?
So as it relates to accessory dwelling units, there is a state law that says that cities are not allowed to charge development impact fees for ADUs that are under 750 square feet. So for a junior ADU is required to be under that amount. So there would not be an opportunity to charge development impact fees for a junior ADU or an ADU that is similar to a JADU.
Okay, so may I follow up with that?
Sure, please do.
So if there is a development and there is incentive to provide several deed restricted ADUs, assuming that all of those ADUs will fall under that 750 square footage. So if a large development turns out for multiple ADUs, then there will still be no infrastructure fees. Is that correct?
Under state law, yes. If all of those ADUs were under 750 square feet, the city could not charge development impact fees.
Then how do we remedy that? Because that's going to be very obviously taxing on the infrastructure.
I mean, short of a change in state law, there's not much locally that we can do to remedy that situation.
Madison, I'm going to ask you to unmute, or excuse me, not Madison, Dana, sorry.
This is Madison. I think you asked the wrong person to unmute. Sorry.
I have several questions. I had them in the Q&A and I was not recognized. They weren't asked. My first question is, are the JADUs attached to detached garages or ADUs required to have their own bathrooms?
Yes, they would be.
Okay, thank you for that, Seth. State law does not require TPAs to be as the crow flies. In fact, Senate Bill 743 that created TPAs said in section 65088.4A that it is the intent of the legislature to balance the need for level of service standards for traffic with the need to build infill housing and mixed-use commercial developments within walking distance of mass transit facilities, downtowns, and town centers, and to provide flexibility to local governments to balance these sometimes competing needs. Now that the planning department has admitted that it has the ArcGIS capability to map walking distance, why is the TPA not reverting to walking distance as Senate Bill 743 intended?
Why is it not reverting?
Yes.
We're basically implementing state law, which says in AB 2097 that says that we cannot apply parking regulation minimums within half mile of major transit. So that's the approach that's what the state legislation says. And so we're going to try to implement that in a way that makes sense.
It doesn't say as the crow flies, Seth. It says within a half mile. And the standard for that was set by Senate Bill 743. And I have just read to you a section of that code that says that it was intended to be walking distance by the legislature. So I don't want to repeat the question.
Did we lose Dana?
I think we did. Let me see if I can try to get Dana back. Here we go.
Was I muted for that?
No, I'm sorry. Please repeat.
It's the same question. The state law does not require a half-mile radius. Senate Bill 743, which established transit priority areas, made it quite clear that it was the intent that it be walking distance from transit, from major transit stops. So my question is, now that the planning department has acknowledged that it has the capacity to map walking distance, why are you resorting to the radial distance, half-mile radial distance, which in many cases, as we have proven to you, means you can walk up to 3 miles to access that transit when you are using a half-mile radial distance, for example, up in Rancho Bernardo or Rancho Penasquitos?
Okay, well, I appreciate the question, Dana, and it's, I think, something that we can take into account as we're developing the AB 2097 implementation. I just want to make sure that whatever we're doing is consistent with what AB 2097 requires.
Okay, does it say in AB 2097 that it is a radial distance of a half-mile?
It says projects that are within a half-mile of
It
transit.
doesn't say radial or as the crow flies.
And it doesn't.
Okay, and I have a third question, which is consistent with one that's been asked before. According to our RENA goals, we need 41.5% of new homes to be built with very low and low income households in mind. And yet, even with our most generous projects, the percentage of affordable units that were generated in 2021, which is the last accounting we have, totaled 9% of total housing units. How are we going to meaningfully address this growing gap? I realize you have one project here that may require 25% of affordable housing at the base zoning level. But once you add the bonuses on, again, that will decrease. What are we going to do to provide 41.5% of new homes to be built for the people who most need them? Because that's really the housing shortage we have, is affordable housing for people of very low and low income households.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because there are a number of ways and a number of proposals that we will be including in the housing action package, including what you mentioned today, housing on public land. Student housing has a requirement for deed restricted housing for students. We plan on addressing affordable housing in our Senate Bill 10 implementation, and also further incentivizing single room occupancy homes. So there's a number of ways that we're going to approach trying to meet those goals, because they are incredibly important that we meet the needs of all San Diegans.
Will any one of these, even individually, get us over 40%?
Any one program individually?
Even one program within its own program, will it produce 40% or more of affordable homes?
40%. I mean, there are opportunities for some of the programs to do that. And that's what we'll be looking to do is try to maximize the opportunities for building affordable homes.
Thank you.
Okay. Madison, I see you have your hand raised. I'm just going to ask if anybody else has a question, since you've already had the opportunity. If not, I'll come back to you, Madison. If anybody else has a question, please raise your hand now. Okay. Tanya, I see your hand. I'm going to unmute you.
Hear me? Hello? Okay.
Yes, we can hear
Yes.
you.
Well, just very quick, I wanted to say that there's a 7-unit proposal here in my neighborhood recently by a realtor. We live within walking distance of a bus stop, and you know, a neighbor was telling me just to give up and let go of this situation, because this issue about the ADUs is a nationwide situation in California, and pretty much we can't do anything until maybe in 2 years, probably voting for a new mayor or other authorities. What's your opinion about it? Thank you.
I think that we need to encourage more housing development. It needs to be done for all San Diegans, and I think we're taking a multifaceted approach to try to meet that need, so that housing can be affordable for residents.
Okay. Moving on, I see a question from Jason. Jason, I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Yeah, hi. I see this, even your email's entitled Homes for All of Us. How is this providing homes for everybody that are equitable when you're just stuffing people into other people's backyards and only charging, you know, only allotting 25%? That's not for everyone. That's just going to congest the neighborhoods. How are you planning on really addressing the housing problem, if there even is one in San Diego?
So I just want to make sure I clarify, 25% would be on for housing on publicly owned land. And so that would need to be land that is available for multifamily development already. So to have and that, in fact, that's already in the code, that if a public agency were to develop its own properties, that 25, if it wanted to take advantage of that program, a minimum of 25% of those units would need to be affordable. We would be expanding that program to allow for more affordable housing to be built on those sites, and that's the intent of that program. As far as the additional items that are mentioned today, we're trying to make sure that we have housing for students, and so we've got a program that encourages and provides incentives for housing for students, and we want to make sure that that program is something that's workable. So we're making some amendments to that. So there's a number of different approaches that we're taking that are outside of accessory dwelling units. And I think that there will be, as we go through the other items in the housing action package, there are more opportunities for a variety of housing types to be built throughout the city.
Yeah, I mean, those are, you're coining them as opportunities, and that's if the person building it decides to increase that percentage, which I highly doubt a developer is going to choose to increase that percentage. So you leave it to the goodwill of the developer. And so I don't think that's a really good approach. And also universities should be responsible for supplying the housing for their students, not the city.
We also, since this is on publicly owned land, it would be, there could be proposals that come from local jurisdictions that include affordable housing. So the intent here is to incentivize that to be done by the public agencies that would be proposing the housing on their properties.
Okay, and then, but as far as ADUs go, there's no affordable housing for the ADUs, right? They're just people building things on their land, correct?
We currently have an ADU home density bonus program that allows for the deed restriction for affordable ADUs.
Okay, but are there other options in ADUs, like actual real houses to build people, as opposed to stuffing them in people's backyards, essentially? I don't think that's a really long-term approach or a good approach to sustainable housing. It's just going to create a burden on the traffic system that already exists, because
Sure.
people aren't going to be living next to their jobs there. They're living next to other people's houses.
Sure. Part of what we're also doing is updating community plans to allow for more housing, and that can be multifamily housing that's located near jobs. We really are looking for a variety of housing types as we move forward. ADUs are a part of that. ADUs play a role, but they're not the only type of housing development that we want to see or that we would encourage in the city.
Okay, I mean, if possible, if you can do something to discourage ADUs, that would be great.
We're going to move on to Rebecca. Rebecca, I'm going to allow you to speak and ask you to unmute.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. What I've noticed in my neighborhood is all the additional ADUs are actually being used as Airbnbs. And they have not been, a solution for long-term housing for people who actually need housing in the neighborhood. I'm just wondering who monitors that and how that is being managed.
We do have a newly adopted ordinance related to home rentals. I think maybe we can take a look, I think through the treasurer's office that handles the regulations, and maybe we can add that to the chat. Can someone on the planning department team take a look into that and add some info to the chat?
I believe we can do that, Seth.
And currently there's a proposal for a 7 unit, 7 units under 750 square foot on my block. And I'm just confused about how that, I would get it if we were in a neighborhood with a college and student affordable housing. But my sense is, as the other houses on the block that have built more than one ADU, they're just being turned into Airbnbs. So again, that's where my concern comes from. If people start building ADU hotels basically in their backyards.
I do see that Melissa Garcia has added a link to the short-term rental occupancy ordinance through the treasurer's office. So I'd encourage you to take a look at that website and see the city's regulations for that.
Okay, thank you.
To that. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to go to Barry. Asked you to unmute.
Good afternoon. Appreciate your time here. The question I have is regarding historic districts. In North Park, historically, there are a lot of significant homes built in the 20s, 30s, 40s. I'm wondering if there's any limitation or legislation that affects historic districts that would prevent historical and cultural neighborhoods in these historic city areas, that some already exist, but that others might be interested in pursuing, if that would be the same approach with these allowances for ADUs that would really start destroying the fabric of historical neighborhoods. I'm just curious what, if any, information you could provide on that.
Sure. Melissa, I think similar to the question about short-term rental occupancies, can we also send, put some link in the chat about the historical districts that the planning department has initiated?
Okay, so we'll go to, while Melissa does that, we'll go to Rami. Rami, I've asked you to unmute. Okay, it seems like Rami's having some trouble, so we'll proceed to Rebecca, and this is Rebecca, and I apologize if I mispronounce your last name, correct me, Egypto. Gonna ask you to unmute.
Yes, it's Egypto. Thank you. Yeah, you were right. Okay. I have a question about if the city has conducted any modeling so that we can get a sense of what effect this kind of projected construction with ADUs and JADUs and lot splits is going to have on the California Air Resources Board goals of first reducing vehicle miles traveled, VMT, and reducing greenhouse gas emissions.
I would say as the programs were adopted, there would have been studies on their location. Something like Complete Communities had an environmental impact report that was approved. We also have a general plan EIR that we rely upon as well. So I can't point to anything specific to your question, but appreciate it.
Okay, is there any plan to do that in the future? Because I would think that there's enough modeling software out there in the world, and most of it open source, that you should be able to do that and pinpoint, for example, past ADU permits and upcoming ADU permits, and extrapolate how many people will be increasing in that area, especially if those ADUs are constructed outside that half-mile TPA zone. Because it seems to me that you would stand the chance of running afoul of CARB goals if you don't have that kind of information. And I think it also should be available to all of us.
Certainly something we can consider.
Thank you.
Okay, George, I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Hi, thank you. I wanted to ask, you alluded to this earlier maybe, but with the comment about the variety of housing that you're focusing on, do we have any of the provisions in the plan that will focus on creating home ownership opportunities, or is it mostly focused on rental opportunities? A reason I ask is that home ownerships are usually a great way to provide housing stability, and they allow families to build equity, and they're an on-ramp to the middle class that hasn't always been available to all communities. So I wanted to ask if home ownership is a focus at all in any of these plans. Thank you.
It's not a focus on any of the items that we brought up today. I think the intent of something like Senate Bill 10 is to encourage more opportunities for home ownership, as well as some legislation that was passed 2 years ago that the city has already adopted in Housing Action Package 1.0 of SB 9, which allows for lot splits and additional units throughout the city.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, David, I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Yeah, I'm going to repeat a question that is part of a question that Madison asked that was never answered. When you're talking about deed restriction, what is the duration of those deed restrictions? How many years?
For what program?
Any of the ones that you talked about deed restrictions today?
Okay, the deed restriction for housing on public land or for student housing would need to be 55 years deed restricted.
Okay, moving on to Don. Can I ask you to unmute?
Yes, I'm wondering, do you plan on doing EIRs on Housing Action Plan 1 or 2, 1.0 or 2.0? And if you're not, what exemptions do you have in state law that exempts these actions from CEQA?
So I would need to rely on our environmental planning division in our office on exactly what the approach would be. But we will analyze the proposals and see if there are existing environmental documents that have been certified that we can rely upon. I will say, I know Senate Bill 10 provides a CEQA exemption for the adoption of an ordinance that implements SB 10. But it's certainly something that we will be looking into as we develop and prepare our code amendment language for Housing Action Package 2.0.
And Diana, can I ask you to unmute?
Hi, thank you. I am one of the neighbors who has the proposal for a 7-unit dwellings on a single family lot. I live within about 100 yards of a canyon. As recommended by CAL FIRE, this area is considered a very high fire, hazard severity zone. what kind of considerations are being given to, really compressing a lot of people into an already congested area, with the fire dangers we have? Thank you.
It's certainly something similar to the previous question about environmental impacts that we'll be reviewing as we draft our code language for Housing Action Package 2.0.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so that's the last of the novel questions. Madison, I'm going to ask you to unmute again.
Hello, yeah, I just had some clarifying questions. So in one of the slides for the ADA accessible ADU incentives, it says the second modification says must include at least one unit that is deed restricted and affordable. So I guess my clarifying question is, will these ADU units be deed restricted affordable, or does it not pertain to deed restriction? And then just a general question. So when you say affordable, at what AMI level are you specifically referring to? Thank you.
So for the accessible ADUs, the existing ADU bonus program allows for the development of units. Basically, if you develop an ADU that is deed restricted affordable, you're allowed to have an additional ADU that is market rate. And so what this would say is that in a ADU bonus program proposal, one of those units, you'd have to have a minimum of one affordable unit, and then a following unit could be ADA accessible, and then you would continue to go. You could continue to put together your ADUs as the current program states, with deed restricted and market rate, deed restricted and market rate. So the ADA accessible unit would not be deed restricted, but there would need to be at least one deed restricted ADU for someone to use that program. So they couldn't do an additional ADU that is ADA accessible until they have at least one affordable ADU that's proposed in their ADU bonus program proposed.
Okay, and then does that align with the deed restriction that is in the current ADU bonus program? I think it's like 10 years for low income, or sorry, very low income, and then 15 years for low income, or does not?
It's a little, well, the existing code is a little bit different. It's 15 years for moderate income deed restriction and 10 years for low or very low. And this proposal doesn't change that. So those would still apply.
Okay, so the student housing and the housing on public land will have a 55-year deed restriction, and then the accessible ADUs will have just the deed restrictions that align with the ADU bonus program currently in place.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we will go, give me one moment. I see Dana has her hand up again. I'll ask you to unmute.
Yeah, I'm wondering, Seth, when can we take a look at this proposed code?
So after we complete our workshops, we plan to draft the code amendment language based on the input that we're hearing, and release that in March, or certainly sometime prior to when it goes to hearing.
Well, obviously we have to see it before it goes to hearing. But when is that? Can you put a date on that?
Well, I think in our schedule, we're planning to go to the Community Planners Committee first. And I think we were looking at an April date for that. So we would want to release it, with enough time for the CPC to be able to review it and make comments and make a recommendation on it.
Okay.
So probably late March, early April.
Okay, since you're doing it differently this time, and you're doing one section of code at a time in 4 different sections, is there any reason that you can't release these one section at a time so the public could have a chance and the CPC could have a chance to review them one at a time rather than having to ingest a major chunk of code over the course of a couple of weeks?
Yeah, we could do that. I think that's a good idea. If you on our housing action package 2.0, we have little individual drop-down boxes for each items, and we could certainly include the code language in there as it's released, and maybe send out a notification for folks that want to take a look at a specific item.
That would be conducive to a more thorough chance to evaluate it and respond to it.
Okay, appreciate the suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you. And just to respond to Madison and anybody else who's listening, to date through the ADU bonus program, there has not been one single ADU that has been deeded affordable to anything less than 110% AMI. So every single deeded affordable ADU through the bonus program has been deeded at 110% AMI or moderate income. There have been no low or very low income ADUs deeded through the program. There have been a couple that were built by the Housing Commission that were deeded at lower incomes, but none through the bonus program. Every single one has been at moderate income so far deeded at 110% AMI. Just so everybody's aware. It's not producing truly affordable housing.
Okay, moving on to Michael. I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Hi, my question is about AB 2097 and whether it eliminates parking minimums for mixed use developments also.
I believe that it would. Melissa, can you put in a link to AB 2097, the code language that the state adopted? I think that might be helpful.
Yes, I'll look for that.
But I believe, Michael, that it did include waiving parking requirements for mixed use.
And that includes all of the commercial parking requirements that the city has in effect?
Correct.
Thank you.
Okay, moving to Andrew.
Yes, Andrew Malik. First off, just wanted to say this is great and very informative. I'm very appreciative of the city of San Diego for being a leader on actually providing some direction on trying to solve our housing crisis. As related to that, there's been some questions in the chat as to the adoption of some of these passcodes that would imply that because people have not necessarily opted in yet, that they've either been failures or weren't worth the effort. Does the planning department track how long it takes before these codes actually do get used and are understood by the industry? Because to me, it would seem that there is a lag, and maybe we should respect that lag.
The answer is yes. We submit to the state of California an annual progress report on our housing element. Some of the information that's included in there are related to city programs and state initiated programs, like we need to report on ADUs that are developed. And some of them do not. We have internal measures to try to track Complete Communities Housing Solutions programs as they are proposed. I would agree that there is a certain lag, and when you look at the data for programs like the ADU programs that were adopted, 4 to 5 years ago, you're seeing much more use of those now than you were in year 1 or year 2. And then you have programs like Senate Bill 9 that were adopted as part of Housing Action Package 1.0 about a year ago that aren't being used very much at all. And so it does take some time, and that's kind of what we've seen through our housing data.
Thank you.
Okay, there are no hands currently raised, so if you do have a question, please raise your hand. All right. I believe, Jason, you've asked, I'll ask you to unmute.
What's an example of public land where somebody might build a multi-housing unit?
An example that's being built right now is next to the Grantville Trolley Station, just north of I-8 near Mission Gorge Road. You'll see there's an elevated trolley stop. The land that's directly north of the trolley stop was owned by MTS, and they're developing the housing that's being built on that site.
Okay, let me ask a bit more direct question. I mean, would this include parks and things like that? Are you going to eliminate green space and build on it, or
no?
How does that work?
Currently, the program does not allow for publicly owned sites that are zoned for parks, open space, or industrial uses to be able to access the development
Okay,
incentive.
cool, thanks.
You're welcome.
Rebecca, I've asked you to unmute.
Okay, am I, oh, okay, here I am. I'm going to go back to the parking minimum requirement and mixed use developments. And I know in North Park, there's been a lot of parking eliminated, and it's created quite a lot of problems with deliveries. So if you eliminate parking for the commercial element of a mixed use development, I don't understand how you're considering where and how these business owners, and we're talking about people like bookstores, dry cleaners, liquor stores, convenience stores, how are they supposed to be getting deliveries? If you, first of all, you have no parking lot for them, there's no required parking, and perhaps there's no on-street parking as well, because you now have dedicated bus lines and things of that nature. How are they supposed to get deliveries? And I refer to what's going on in North Park right now. It's a very real problem. The UPS drivers will park in the left turn lane because they have nowhere else to park.
I think that's something that we can certainly consider. It doesn't say that there is no parking that's allowed for deliveries, or maybe there's a space or a carve out that could be included on site for those kind of deliveries. But it's certainly something that we can consider in our local implementation, as long as it's not running afoul of what's in the state approved bill.
Yeah, because, well, in the case of North Park, it's a very real problem. So obviously no one considered that. Just saying, and thank you for the time. Thanks.
Thank you. We have an opportunity here to take a look at it, so appreciate the comment.
Sure.
Okay, and Michael?
So my question is, do you expect that there will be more potential projects that will be able to be approved with ministerial permits after the adoption of these changes to the codes?
The housing on public land, I believe allows for ministerial approval. I don't think student housing would necessarily allow for it. It's just a bonus that can be included in a development. So that's the only one out of the initiatives that we've talked about today.
There is a submitted project in my neighborhood that's a mixed use that is being processed, I believe, under the ministerial permit. It's near a transit stop, etc. But my greater question is, it's very, very difficult to get any type of public information to be able to understand the project, not just for citizens, but for community planning groups. And so the transparency here seems to be way off with ministerial permits. And so if there's going to be an increase of in their use because of new laws, I would hope that you, starting today, could make that process more transparent, allow the release of building plans and deviations requested by developers, things like that. So those of us who have a handle on that level of detail can really see what these projects are going to be looking like and how they're going to be impacting our neighborhoods, so we don't have avoidable problems. And right now I've been directed by the planning department to pursue a public records request, which is now a month old, to get any available information, but no one will tell me whether or not there is any available information that I will receive once my request is completed. So I would really urge you guys to take a strong look at providing more basic information to citizens who request it, because the developers are not required to go in front of the planning groups anymore. And that just, again, leaves everyone in the area in the dark, which doesn't help us make it a better project even. Thank you.
Appreciate the suggestion. Thank you.
Okay, and Joseph, gonna come to you.
Yeah, thanks for the informative presentation. I'm listening to the comments, and I think one thing that always surprises me is the fact that folks forget that it's a lot of state law that's really pushing cities to have to comply, and it's not local city planning departments pushing all these bills. So I think that's just general comment for the group. I have two questions for you. One I posted in the Q&A, but that one has to do with the transition from planning to DSD. And I just was curious if you could talk a little bit about what happens internally when laws are passed locally at the city, rules are changing, things that DSD planners are typically used to conforming projects to are no longer applicable. And just what does that process look like? The second one is AB 2097, and if it applies in the coastal zone, if that is part of, if the Coastal Commission oversight on that bill is applicable to the city's coastal areas. Thanks.
Thank you. The implementation is always something that is a bit of a challenge. We do try to work closely with development services to ensure that whatever is being brought forward by us, whether it's implementing state law or a proposal that's coming from the planning department, is something that DSD can implement and can weigh in on, and make sure that we have as smooth of a transition as possible. And then secondly, for AB 2097, in the coastal zone, we anticipate it would be an amendment to our local coastal plan. So we will be discussing it with Coastal Commission staff and making that determination at a later time.
Okay, back to Jason.
Yeah, hi. I know a lot of this is coming down from the state, but SB 10 is opt-in, correct? Like, it's up to you whether you choose to increase density. Is that a true statement?
That's correct. SB 10 gives cities the option to develop an ordinance to implement it.
Okay, so yeah, so I just want to be clear here. This isn't the state always pushing things. It's up to our city to interpret it and what we choose to opt into as well.
Appreciate the comment.
Okay, there are no other hands currently raised. If there are any additional questions, please raise your hand. Oh, we have one. Dana, I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Thanks. I just wanted to go back to an earlier question. Seth, you didn't list Senate Bill 10 as ministerial projects, but am I correct that those would be ministerial projects?
Well, we'll get to SB. I didn't mention it because the question was what of the items that we talked about today were there ministerial approvals that were included there. But yes, Senate Bill 10 would allow for ministerial approval of projects.
Thanks for that confirmation.
Okay, again, if anybody has any questions, please raise your hand. We got another from Robert. Robert, I'm asking you to unmute.
Yeah, thank you. Seth, do you guys work with the people who are doing community plan updates?
Yes, we do. We're under the same division as our community planning team.
So here's my question. I'm in UC, and the community plan update survey, I don't know if you've seen it or not, basically calls for the elimination of neighborhood shopping in favor of hundreds of apartments. Do you see something wrong with that, taking away neighborhood shopping?
I'm here to talk about our Housing Action Package 2.0 proposals, and there is a public process to talk about the community plan updates. I'd encourage you to attend those meetings. And
I do attend those. I email everyone in the chain, and once you get past the woman who just took Witherspoon's spot, her bosses never respond to an email.
I don't have much that I can add. It's a separate process that I'd encourage you to comment through that process.
Okay, one other question then, Seth, if you can't expound on my first question. Caught part of it, so I just want to make sure I heard you correctly about dormitory style student housing. Was that meant to be placed in neighborhoods or appropriate places for high-rise dormitories?
It would be in places where there is existing zoning for multifamily use. So it could be in a place that, depending on the zone, depending on the location, would already be eligible for multifamily development.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Okay, again, if there are any additional questions, now's the time. Okay, we are not seeing any more questions.
Any more questions in the chat?
So there's one additional question in the Q&A. How do you plan to assure that student housing dorm type will be occupied by students if there is no university oversight?
There is a requirement in our existing student housing program that says that that it has to be rented to a student who can show verification that they attend a college or a university. So that requirement would not change.
All right. And again, last call for questions. If there are any additional questions, please either raise your hand or ask it via text in the Q&A.
Okay, thanks everyone for participating. Appreciate your input. And just a reminder, we have another workshop scheduled for Thursday to talk about 4 more items. And then we have in-person workshops in March. So look forward to seeing you and participating in those workshops as well. Everyone have a great day. Thank you.